There's no more powerful engine driving an organization toward excellence and long-range success than an attractive, worthwhile, and achievable vision of the future widely shared. Hello, my friend, and welcome to this solo Friday episode of A Call to Leadership. I'm so glad you're here. Every Friday, I host a series on leadership, and it's really a way to focus on one specific tool for your leadership tool belt. And this show is for the leader who needs guidance, who desires guidance in finding purpose, meaning, value, to master your context rather than surrender to it. And I'm your host, your guide, Dr. Nate Sala. I am thrilled to be a part of your journey as an educator at the university level, as an entrepreneur, a father, a husband, and someone who cares deeply about moving leadership forward, progressing in the human condition as servants, aiming for greatness, and how we create an irresistible offer for a life. So one of the questions that I've gotten over the years, and I love to unpack it with you on this new series, is the big question: are leaders born or made? It's a huge question because really what it does is it asks about how we identify leaders. Now, you might think your leadership has been good or evolving. And you might think, well, I was born with certain attributes that are associated with leadership, such as intelligence or self-confidence or determination or integrity or sociability. Those are actually all 5 major leadership traits that are closely associated with leadership. And the truth of the matter is that we can get confused on how leadership develops in people. You might think, well, I know that some people are inclined to be great leaders, if you will. And this is actually an old theory on leadership, one of the earliest theories on leadership, called the great man theory, or theories. How about that for sexist, right? It basically was research that focused on these individual characteristics that researchers believed universally differentiated leaders from non-leaders, and they were considered these innate qualities. And so this is early trait theory, if you will. And so going all the way back to Plato, he proposed that philosophers make the best kings, if you will, or leaders. And not everyone is born to be a leader, but those who have these inborn qualities to rule must also be educated to do so. So that's his theory back in 380 BC, so long ago. And then in the 1800s, this theory really began to develop, and then historically that leaders were determined to be heroes like a Shakespeare or a Luther or a Napoleon, and that great leaders were born, not made, that they had these inherent traits that were like the secret to their greatness. So think of like heroic leaders, mythic leaders, those destined to rise. Can think about like an Alexander or a George Washington. So this was a theory that developed that great personalities, they were the movers, the shakers. They moved events and shaped societies. But, in the 60s, actually all the way back to the 40s, these new investigations of leadership began to challenge that theory, that idea that leaders were just born to be leaders. In fact, it did show, some of the studies showed that individual traits such as intelligence or birth order or your socioeconomic status or child rearing, they could have an effect on what's strongly associated with the perception of leadership. But what we found later was that traits could be learned, that social intelligence could be learned, that psychological perspectives could be changed. And so the assumptions that leaders were somehow different in the possession of their special, unique, extraordinary personalities or attributes or abilities or skills or personal characteristics, things that others didn't have, was beginning to be dispelled. So the question then is, are leaders born or made? And I'm just going to answer it. The answer is yes. So you say, well, that can't be yes because it's an either or, but it's not really. It can be an and a yes. And here's the thing. Sometimes we're born with certain attributes that are closely associated with the perceptions of leadership. And just like those that I had mentioned earlier, right? Intelligence, self-confidence, being determined, having integrity, being sociable. Those are all related to leadership. Doesn't make you an effective leader necessarily just because you have those. And you might be listening and you might say, I have those natural abilities, but I might not have been exhibiting leadership at my highest potential. Or you might be on the other side and say, some of those areas, maybe I'm not really confident. Maybe I fall off in my determination. Maybe my integrity has been breached from time to time. Maybe I'm not the most social person. Maybe I don't think I'm the smartest. Well, that doesn't mean necessarily that you can't be an effective leader. In fact, you may have some of those natural tendencies. I did when I was growing up. I had some of those natural tendencies. I was probably overly confident, probably arrogant, haughty. And if you listen back to our episode on humility, I talk about that in detail. I've always been extremely determined, just like a pit bull, locking on, focus, hyper-focused, to probably even to my own detriment, because my spouse has even said, you get so hyper-focused, you can't see anything else. You are just determined to get that job done. Very sociable, intelligent in terms of like academics. It was always pretty easy. And it's not necessarily to boast, it's just the way it was. And so those might have been traits that are closely associated with leadership. But let me tell you, friend, I haven't always been an effective leader. That doesn't necessarily check those boxes and then you're going to be a great leader. No. Great leadership, effective leadership, has so much more involved than just having some of those foundational traits. And on the other side of it, I've had to learn some of those traits. In terms of integrity, my integrity hasn't always been an integrity that's been solid. I have not always been whole. I mean, I've lied, I've cheated, I've stealed. There's intelligence for you, right? I've stolen. And I've been divided. We use the word integrity. It shares etymology, or it's a fancy word for language. It shares the root wording with the word integer. A little math review for you. So an integer is a whole number. It can't be divided. So think of the number 3, 5, 7. It's indivisible. So the idea then with integrity is that my beliefs, my character, my decisions, who I am behind closed doors is undivided. I'm the same. I have integrity. Think of also another way to put it is consider a ship, right? And you have a leadership, and your leadership is sailing, and you have a hull on your ship, and it's the area around your ship that has to remain strong because it has to keep the water out. And when the hull is breached, for example, with the Titanic, when the Titanic hit the iceberg, that hull was breached. And then water began to come in and flood the ship. And that ship sank and killed many people. Tragically, they died. And that's a picture of integrity. When the hull of our integrity is breached, it can be devastating. And that's a picture of leadership that is ineffective, that leads not to a better future state, but leads to trials and problems and sometimes destruction. And I was on my road to destruction. I was on my road to nowhere. And I had to turn and learn to walk in integrity. And that's what we're talking about. Are leaders born or made? You see, you can have your hull breached. You may not have always walked in integrity like myself. And you begin to associate yourself with people who do walk in integrity. That's one way we can begin to walk in integrity, is to look at the company we keep. The human mind, the human behavior, we're malleable, we're moldable, we're pliable, and we're pliable in a lot of different ways. Our environment plays a big role in how and who we become and how we develop. And so when we're thinking about how our integrity is developing, how our intelligence, our self-confidence, our determination, our sociability, all of those top 5, if you will, traits that are closely associated with the perception of leadership. But let's just talk about the one, integrity, right now. I was hanging out with the wrong crew. I was leading the wrong crew. I was getting into all kinds of trouble. And I was in a rough spot. And then I began to find mentors in my own life who began to speak real integrity into my life and show me what it meant to walk in honor, to walk with moral fiber, to walk with ethics, to not have a life where ill-gotten gain or deceitful gain was the standard or the norm. I began to reject that. And then my level of integrity began to increase. And when your level of integrity begins to increase, so does your trustworthiness, because trust and integrity go hand in hand, because your integrity is part of a character trait. In fact, Stephen Covey said, and if you've listened to some other of the episodes, it bears repeating, that the pillars of trust, he believed, were competence and character. And so if you have competence, you know how to do the work that's called to be done, and you have character to do the right thing for the right reasons, to do it with integrity, then those are foundational, if you will, for trustworthiness. And as leaders, we must be trustworthy. If we don't walk in integrity, then how could we ever be trusted to follow through, to carry out what we say we're going to do? Because we may tell one person, in fact, I just had this conversation recently, we may tell one person that we're going to go this direction on our team, let's say in a business environment. And then we tell someone else on our team that we're going to go a different direction. Why? Because if I would have told that other person we're going in the direction I've told this person number 1 and person number 2, let's say, maybe person number 1 will quit, or person number 2 will quit. So if I don't want to keep them from quitting, I'm just going to tell them what they want to hear. Well, that's a lack of integrity. And really, that's a cop-out on leading effectively, because we are taking the easy road. But the problem with the easy road sometimes is the easy road crumbles because it's not built on a strong foundation. And so the right thing to do is to get both people in that room and explain why we must go in the direction we must go in, because it's in the best interest of everyone on the team. Because leadership is about, yes, discovery. It's about influence. It's about achievement, yes. But it's the most important aspect of leadership is shared purpose. Shared purpose. So it's been said by Bert Nannis, a scholar in visionary leadership, that there's no more effective, let me see if I get this right by memory, there's no more powerful engine driving an organization toward excellence and long-range success than attractive, worthwhile, and achievable vision of the future widely shared. That's the key, widely shared. So if you have 2 people in the organization who have different views on that attractive, worthwhile, and achievable vision of the future, and they don't share it, then you've got to be a leader of integrity and explain why we're going this way, so that you can either get people on board to share the vision, or perhaps they're on the wrong leadership. Perhaps they need to be on a different ship. And that's okay too. Here's another piece of it. Perhaps you need to hear more about where your purpose is missing in the lives of those who you are leading. In other words, are you spending time learning about your own people and spending time learning about what their needs are? I know I haven't always done that, but the more I've done that, the more I've just sat in the company of those who I get to steward and be a part of, the more my vision begins to develop and get even more robust, because I'm now creating and crafting a more effective and a more attractive vision with those who I get to walk alongside of. And then my integrity isn't breached because I'm actually strengthening my integrity. The whole is being strengthened by the collective minds of this leadership. So it's not just about me. So this is what we're talking about. Leadership, leaders, yes, we can be born with certain traits, but most importantly, we are driven to move forward by embracing, growing in those traits. And integrity is the first and the most important one. And then we can go through each of these other ones individually. But I would say if we can walk in integrity, if we can walk in wholeness, then those who walk alongside of us know what they're getting. They know what they're getting. In fact, you may not always agree, and that's okay, but they know where you stand. And that's a place of safety. You see, it's unsafe in an environment when your leader is not only clear, but you can't trust that they walk with wholeness and with undividedness in their speech, in their communication, in their decisions, in their behavior. And so what happens is you create an unsafe environment. And when there's an unsafe environment, people cannot flourish. When there's an unsafe environment, people cannot give their best. They cannot do their best possible work. Why? Because their focus is on protection. Their focus is on how can I make myself safe? And there's an unwritten contract in organizations, in any leadership, really. It's this relationship between obedience and safety to do the best possible work I can do. So you give me, I will be obedient to you in terms of this is the direction we're going. We'll row together. And you give me the safety to work with the freedom and autonomy to do my best possible work. But if I'm having to protect myself, that takes energy away from me giving my very best. So by walking in integrity as a leader, integrity of protecting the mission, protecting the vision, protecting the values, protecting the culture, protecting the organizational integrity, if you will, of the entire organization as a whole, I'm providing a safe place for you. And that carries over to families. In our family environments, do we have integrity? Is our yes, yes, and our no, no? Do our spouses and our children, do they rely on us? In other words, you know what integrity is too? Integrity is when you say you're going to do something, you actually follow through. That's integrity. So when my son was little, he was just like most kids, testing the waters with most of his questions. He was empirical, and often when I would say no or tell him that we needed to do whatever it was some way, he would perform a scientific experiment and he would ask, well, let's see if Dad is serious. Let's see if that hypothesis that he won't react in a way that is unhappy with my behavior is true. And so he would test me. And he was one of those kids who I would consider to be very independent-minded, to say the least. And so we had challenges in terms of how I disciplined him. And we had different levels of discipline. One would be what we call a reminder, and that would just be possibly a timeout, time to think about it. Sometimes he had to stand in a corner for a few minutes and let his emotions calm down just a little bit. Sometimes we had a toy that we couldn't play with for a little bit. And of course, there was also positive reinforcement. Those are all negative reinforcements. But I didn't always walk in integrity, friend, in terms of how I followed through. And this idea of follow through and integrity going hand in hand, I missed it sometimes. There were instances where I would make a threat, if you will, or explain what a consequence would be, and I didn't follow through with it. And I knew that he was testing my integrity. He was testing me to see if I was a person of follow through. And years later, so this was when he was a toddler, about 6, 7 years old, we were going through some challenges, and I had said, son, we're not going to be able to go on our family trip to Disney this year if we don't straighten up our behavior. And that's a reward that we get. And so I want to see the best out of you. And he tested me. And I had to make a decision at that point. Will I walk in integrity, even if it hurts me? Because I wanted that joy. I wanted that experience. I wanted the whole family to enjoy that trip. And of course, I did talk with my spouse. But I told my son, I said, son, we're not going to get to go on our trip this year because, you've pushed the limit of what we talked about. And it was really tough. It was a tough decision. It was tough on all of us. And it wasn't necessarily that I was being stubborn. It was that I had to honor what I said I was going to do and carry it out. And we went without a vacation. I missed that vacation, and so did we all. But we ended up doing something else, and that worked out. But from that point on, my son began to actually respect me a little bit more because I was a man of my word. And that created a new era of our relationship. And he later began to see that, okay, well, Dad is going to honor his word. And that meant in the good ways too, not necessarily in punishment. But if Dad says he's going to take me on a trip, he'll do everything he can to do that. If Dad says he's going to build a pool, right? He's going to do everything he can to do that. Now, are there things that are beyond our control? Of course there are. But this sends the signal to our followers that we will walk in integrity. And that's a great place to be. Sometimes it's not easy, but it is doable. Are there times where you can reconsider? Yes, of course. Don't be so stalwart that, you're a rock that can't change. Of course not. But that's not a lack of integrity. That's simply a matter of reconsidering a situation based on new information, new evidence. And that's okay. That doesn't change your level of integrity. That actually bolsters it. But how we interact with our own families is also a part of that. Our communities. Walking in integrity, learning to walk in integrity. I can't stress how critical that is to being an effective leader, whether you're born with an atmosphere of integrity or whether you grow and you are made to be a person that walks in integrity. That is a clear indication that you are beginning to embrace an essential aspect, an essential characteristic of leadership. And so that's just the first one. We're going to cover the other 4, if you will, in subsequent episodes on this series, Are Leaders Born or Made? I'm so glad you're here. I hope this episode was helpful for you. I hope that you'll take this nugget home with you and begin to just be mindful and intentional about the value of integrity in your leadership, not only in who you are called to be a leader as you aim for greatness, but also who you follow. I'm Dr. Nate Sala. Thank you for joining me on this episode of A Call to Leadership. To Leadership.